we begin in Morocco, where thousands of officials are gathered for the opening of the 22nd conference of the parties. Officials say they're coming into COP22 with tremendous positive momentum, and that's after the Paris Climate Agreement came into effect earlier this month. It is the most comprehensive international plan to combat the worst effects of rising global temperatures. Now, previous meetings have shown that both developing and developed nations can still disagree on how ambitious emissions cuts need to be. Right, let's get you more on that story now. And I'm joined live from Marrakech by CCTV's Maria Galang. Maria, what's the latest coming out of the COP22 conference?
Hi Beatrice, well COP22 is officially underway. It was opened by the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the President of COP22 and Morocco's Foreign Minister. Over the next 12 days we're going to be seeing a whole bunch of people here, CEOs of companies, investors, the civil society. They're all going to be discussing, and most importantly governments, heads of states, they're all going to be discussing how to bring greenhouse gas emissions down. They're also going to be discussing how to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And it's not going to be an easy task. Let's hear from CCTV's Dan Williams for more on this.
Final preparations at the COP22 conference site in Marrakech, Morocco, ahead of the arrival of some 22,000 participants from across the globe. Last year's landmark Paris Climate Change Agreement came into force last week. It calls for an unprecedented reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but the task ahead remains formidable.
This is a moment of celebration, but at the same time, it's a moment of reflection on the task ahead and the challenges that we need to face. Work will continue in Marrakech to complete the details of a transparent global regime or rule book, which will account for, review, and underpin greater action by all sides.
The US presidential election casts a shadow over events here. Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump is a global warming skeptic and, if elected, has vowed to dismantle the agreement within his first 100 days in office.
Of course, we will be ready and willing to work with the president that is elected in the US. We would hope that we could engage in a very constructive and positive relationship. It is one of our most important partners, and it is, of course, its participation in this agreement is crucial.
That aside, one of the key areas of discussion here will focus on how to support developing nations and help them build and utilize clean energy futures.
I think the North countries have to do something with the cooperation with the South, the countries of the South, to build those projects in a concrete way. And this is with a very close connection to the stability and security in the whole region of Africa.
COP22 is unlikely to have the fireworks of previous climate conferences, but that doesn't make it any less crucial. Paris saw a global pledge to combat climate change. Now comes the difficult part in making that promise a reality. Dan Williams, CCTV, Marrakech.
Well, Maria, Africa is the most affected continent, though, when it comes to climate change. What will African delegates, though, be pushing for at the COP22 summit?
Yes, Beatrice, well, while some African countries are among the 86 parties that have ratified the Paris Agreement, many are still vague on how they actually plan to adopt it. There's some lack of cost estimates, there's no indications of sources of funding, and in many cases no actual access to climate information or climate finance. And And Africa indeed is the continent that has been most affected by climate change. We're experiencing severe and prolonged droughts, and that's with us only contributing about 5% to global greenhouse gas emissions. So really the main aim at this conference for African countries will be on how to build capacity, create better mechanisms to absorb climate finance and information, and really take advantage of the opportunities that the Paris Agreement is going to bring about. Now, for more information on this, I'm joined by the COP22 spokesperson, Nick Nattel. Nick, thank you for joining me.
Yes, very happy to be here.
Take us through the main aim of this summit.
Well, it's quite a remarkable day because we're meeting less than 12 months after the great Paris Agreement was adopted last year, and we're meeting because just a few days ago this Paris Agreement came into legal force around the world. And more countries, including in Africa, are now ratifying this Paris Agreement, bringing it into legal effect in their own national legislation. And so the process is building. It's only 12 months since Paris, nothing can happen overnight. So this is the next step here in Marrakech. As you say, it's an African COP, as they call it, and there'll be a lot of focus on how to bring that capacity you mentioned, how to bring that finance to the African nations. One of the big figures is $100 billion by 2020 for developing countries, from developed countries, and we'll see a lot of evidence, I think, today, in fact, from a roadmap and also from various assessments today that we're on track, the world is on track to deliver that $100 billion by 2020. But that's just the beginning.
Well, Nick, I'm sure there's a lot of obstacles to achieving these aims. Take us through some of them.
Well, some of the obstacles are that we're trying as a world to actually change 2 centuries of development based on fossil fuels. And that literally doesn't happen overnight. And every country is in different circumstances of development. How do you support them? How do they change the designs of their cities, their transportation networks, their energy systems? How do you manage natural systems like forests, because they're really important? So this is a big, big effort. The whole thing that's been agreed in Paris is that everybody agrees we have to do it. In the past, some countries weren't sure whether we had to do it. I think everyone agrees we have to do it. Everyone agrees that inaction is not an option, because we'll get more natural disasters, more damage to the economy, and more human suffering everywhere, including Africa. So one of the big obstacles will be, how do we get the money flowing? To actually make this grand transition to sustainable development and climate-friendly future will cost $5 to $7 trillion a year. So how do we mobilize that kind of finance? The best estimate is we've probably got about $1 trillion flowing into green technologies and things like that. But there's still a big gap. So the financing gap is really significant for everybody, everywhere, including Africa.
Okay. The conference is being hosted in Marrakech. It's a beautiful city, not today, right?
No,
today
it's
raining.
Yeah, right.
But what is the significance in hosting this conference here?
Yeah, well, so it's in Africa, and I think that's very significant indeed. In Paris, many people said we must do a lot for Africa. There will be a lot of initiatives showcased here for Africa, renewable energy initiatives, for example. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. There's a lot of renewable energy going into Africa right now. A country like Kenya is exploiting geothermal electricity up the Rift Valley, incredible amounts of megawatts being put on. So nobody's starting from ground zero here. But we really have to step up the scale and the acceleration, because the reality is that the emissions going to the atmosphere right now are still increasing. We need to peak global emissions everywhere within, say, 5 or 10 years and dramatically manage them down over the coming decades. So for Africa, that's a great challenge, because a lot of countries here are also at very different levels of development. From the South Africas and Morocco, which as a country is putting in tons of renewable energy. I mean, you can go across this country right now and see solar, large companies coming to invest. Siemens from Germany setting up a factory in Tangier to make wind turbines. A lot is happening. So Morocco is significant because it is progressing very fast, and I think a lot of others can learn a lot from Morocco.
Okay, you mentioned Morocco, Kenya, they're stepping up their efforts, but a lot of other African countries have not signed up to the agreement. How concerned is the UNFCCC on the lack of support from some of these countries, and what's the plan to bring Africa on board?
Well, it's absolutely an amazing question that you ask, because, the idea that within less than 12 months, 100 governments around the world have ratified. I mean, every African country has signed the agreement. They did it in Paris. You sign and then you ratify, you bring it into law. So quite a lot of African countries have done. Everybody's moving at different speeds, but honestly, to imagine that there's a problem here, there really isn't. I mean, many African countries, we are sure, will have, all of them, in fact, probably will have ratified the agreement by the end of this year. I'm sure some will also do it at this conference, and certainly by the beginning of next year. You know, so the speed at which this ratification is happening is awesome. That's probably not the issue. The issue is what happens now. And it's about that investment we talked about. It's about building that capacity. There are some very poor countries in Africa that really don't have the infrastructure to, as you mentioned before, accept the money, right, and to spend it in a way that's going to be meaningful to their people. So those need to be dealt with, and this COP is about that. This is about building this new future that everyone's embarked upon.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. Well, you've heard it there. It's not going to happen overnight. There's going to be a lot more discussions needed. There's going to be, we're going to need to find out who's going to be paying for this Paris Agreement to be put into effect. But Africa is well on its way to ensuring that it's together with the rest of the world in achieving this. There's going to be a lot of discussions over the next 12 days, so we'll be keeping you up to speed on the outcomes of those meetings. Back to you, Beatrice.
Maria Galang for us there following the COP22 summit in Marrakech.